Hello, pattern readers. This video will be the first in a series I'm calling How to Adapt, in which I'm taking a topic or character or some other element of the Wheel of Time book series, and I talk about what challenges it might present to adaptation for the upcoming TV show. In other words, why might certain aspects of the books need to be changed in order for it to work well in a streaming series? And then I'll give some suggestions for how I might change it. And in some cases, I might discuss multiple options because, of course, a lot will depend on the overall vision the creative team has for the show. Choosing to talk about the romances in the Wheel of Time first seemed a pretty logical choice because it's a pretty common fan opinion that as wonderful a writer as Robert Jordan was, he didn't always sell the many romances he wrote as well as he might have. So I'm going to put all the major romances into one of three categories. The minor changes category is for ones that I think work pretty well as they are and would only need a few smaller tweaks to make it work for a new audience. The major alterations category are for ones that I think should be kept in the show, but that would need some significant changes to make them be as effective on screen as possible. And the balefired category are for ones that would be best removed from the fabric of the show entirely. To be clear, just because I'm advocating for something to be balefired from the show does not mean that I think it should have been removed from the books or that it is entirely without merit. Just that I think it would be more trouble to make it work than it's worth. I'll also mention some minor romances and raise the question, should any romances be added to the show? Before I get into the categories, I wanted to talk about two common problems that I see with many of the Wheel of Time romances that can explain why a lot of them don't work as well as they could have. First is that Robert Jordan didn't put enough time into showing a lot of his characters falling in love. A lot of the relationships are very light to non-existent in that phase of the relationship. So we end up not really understanding why these characters are in love or really believing in them as a couple. And then second is that a lot of the couples spend a lot of the series separated, like a lot, which can make for a lack of investment in the pair. So starting with the minor changes category, I'm going to talk about why I think each one has the basic elements it needs to work and what small changes could make it work even better. So from here on out, I am going to get into book spoilers. Fair warning, this video is best viewed after you have completed the series, but I am going to make sections and mark them with the relevant book spoilers, so feel free to hover over the progress bar to check if there are any sections that might be safe for you to watch. First up is my favorite romance in the Wheel of Time, and that is Nynaeve and Lan. Now, the interesting thing about this one is that they actually have those elements I just mentioned plague a lot of the romances. Not a lot of time is spent showing them falling in love, and they spend a lot of the series apart. And yet I think Robert Jordan manages to get a lot of fans invested in this couple in spite of those limitations. So what is it about them that makes them basically work? Because the show should make an effort to include those elements. I think just enough of their dynamic with each other is shown in the eye of the world so that when we get to the end of the book and we have the revelation that they are in love, we can look back and understand what drew them to each other in the first place. Nynaeve catches Lan's attention because she's able to track him, which is super impressive. And then they have this unspoken competition where Nynaeve tries to sneak up on Lan without him noticing. It's really subtle but sweet that what draws them to each other is respect for each other's competence and skill. They're also both fierce protectors by nature, so they have that in common. The show has one advantage when it comes to showing them falling in love because they're not going to stay locked mostly in Rand's POV, so they can easily have scenes between Nynaeve and Lan that showcases this mutual respect dynamic and shows their concern for each other when they're in danger. These are things that are likely happening off screen in the book, and so it's a really simple, easy kind of change. One thing that I think will likely be different is that Nynaeve will probably leave Emond's Field at the same time as the main group, rather than following after them. So this wouldn't give her the same opportunity to track. So the show should make a point of showcasing Nynaeve's skills, as well as her dedication to protecting her friends, in other ways, so that Lan can notice and be impressed. And then this little playful competition that they have might need to be called attention to a little bit more rather than leaving it unspoken. Maybe give them a little bit more banter. And then if Nynaeve is the one who can crack Lan's stone-faced, stoic demeanor, once Nynaeve makes her confession of love and Lan admits his own while also claiming that his vows and duties prevent him from being with her, their dynamic is set. Lan believes that his death is inevitable, and Nynaeve does not accept this. And so it gives us a reason why they're not together, and a reason to long for them to overcome what stands between them. Robert Jordan does well to keep referring to their feelings even when they're not in the same place, and the show is going to have to do something similar. So the additional small changes that I recommend are to show some things that happen off screen on screen, such as when Egwene notices that Nynaeve is angry and crying after speaking with Lan, but we never saw the conversation. And then a lot of our understanding of how much they mean to each other comes from other characters noticing it. So Moiraine and Egwene and even Rand having internal thoughts about it. So a lot of that is going to have to be spoken out loud somehow, but these are all very minor changes. My next pairing in this category, Perrin and Faile, is a less popular one, but I've defended them before, and I stand by saying that they can work even better with only small changes. So first off, Perrin and Faile don't have either of the common problems. Enough time is spent on showing them falling in love, and they spend a lot of the series together. What I happen to like most about them is that it's a rare instance where we get to see a couple have conflict and work hard to get through it, and then grow and improve both individually and as a couple who then end up communicating a lot better. It's really much more true to life, and I find it refreshing. So what don't people like about it? Well, the miscommunication trope is a problem for a lot of people. It can be hard to read at times. And because they're a cross-cultural couple, it gets amplified in their case. This is an instance where a little can go a long way. In the books, it's stretched out over books, and while this might be realistic, I think the same thing can be accomplished over a shorter time frame and with fewer scenes. In the same way, people have a hard time with the sequence where Faile is captive and Perrin is trying to rescue her, simply because it goes on for such a long stretch. I happen to find Faile's character growth in captivity really lovely and interesting to read, and I think if it's done in a condensed time frame, it's going to work a lot better. This is an instance where the adaptation is going to naturally lend itself to less repetition, and this is only going to benefit the storyline in this case. There's also the issue of Perrin's super wolf smell-o-vision, which I would argue causes some people to dislike Faile unfairly. She is understandably reacting emotionally to Berelain's attempts to interfere in her marriage and the way Perrin responds to Berelain. But she's keeping her emotions in check. She's not really acting on them. It's mainly an issue because Perrin can smell how she feels. How the show is going to handle Perrin's super senses is a topic for another video, but in this very specific instance, I think the visual medium might help again, because if we can see the actress playing Faile not overreacting, it might naturally make us a little bit more sympathetic to her than we would feel being in Perrin's head all the time. Lastly, the one thing that I truly dislike about this couple is the one instance of domestic violence. Faile repeatedly hitting Perrin until he snaps and spanks her. I hate it. Just cut it. They can keep the Saldean preference for yelling matches as foreplay if they want, but any instance of hitting your partner, it's got to go. My third pairing in this category is also a controversial one, and that's because one character, Mat, is very popular, and the other character, Tuon, is pretty unpopular. I would actually say that the fundamentals of their relationship work really well, and the only changes that really need to be made are to the arc of Tuon's character, which could make her more sympathetic. I really like the unusual progression of their relationship. They're thrown together by the pattern, and they both know it. And then there's this dance that they play where they're each trying to win the other over while also maintaining some agency and power in the relationship. And of course, both inadvertently catching feelings in the process. Other than making sure the audience understands the unspoken games they are playing with each other, I think they can stick fairly close to the dynamic that Robert Jordan wrote. One scene in particular gives me actual chills, and I hope they find a way to include it. It's the moment when she starts to see him in a different light. A lion stuffed into a horse stall might look like a peculiar joke, but a lion on the high plains was something very different. Toy was loose on the high plains now. She felt a chill. What sort of man had she entangled herself with? After all this time, she realized, she had hardly a clue. So what's the problem? The problem, in my opinion, is mainly that Tuon is too static of a character. She starts off rigid in her beliefs that women who can channel are dangerous and they need to be leashed as damane. And then she finds out that she can learn to channel, and that is the reason why she can leash a damane, and it seems to not affect her thinking at all. She remains comfortable with slavery in all of its forms. So yeah, not very likable. Presumably, since Robert Jordan planned a post A Memory of Light Outrigger series that would take place in Shan-Chan and feature Mat and Tuon, perhaps he planned to address that aspect of her character then. Well, the show should do it in the main narrative instead. Show evolution of her views when confronted with new information. It will make for a better and more interesting character and perhaps rescue what is otherwise a pretty effective romance. Next, the relationships that need more major structural changes to work best in the show. First up, the big one, Rand with Min, Elaine, and Aviendha. This one is so complicated that I actually plan to do a completely separate video just to talk about it. Certain aspects of this work better than others. The setup for Rand and Elaine is minimal, and they spend most of the series apart. The setup for Rand and Aviendha works pretty well, but then they spend most of the series apart. The parts that work best are Rand Min and Elaine Aviendha. When asked about how this poly relationship might differ in the show, Rafe Judkins said he was more interested in polyamory than polygyny. This distinction doesn't really answer what they're going to do, but it raises the possibility that the women, some or all of them, might have romantic and sexual relationships with each other in addition to Rand and their existing friendships. There's so much different possibilities and nuance to dig into here. I don't want to short it. Make sure to stay tuned for that upcoming video. Now for one that is probably the most hated, and so you might wonder why I'm not balefiring it, and that is Egwene and Gawyn. I'm not balefiring this one because I think with some significant changes, it has the potential to be a very effective, tragic love story. The key word being tragic here, which means I would not fundamentally alter the ending of it. The good in this relationship is all potential, not execution. So let's just dive right into what doesn't work. Virtually no time is spent showing them falling in love. And one scene that does is a really weird instance of Egwene being literally pulled into Gawyn's sex dream. They should cut that. And then they quickly realize and declare their love for each other, and then they're separated again for most of the series. So we never buy into them as a pair. There's the problem of Gawyn himself, who starts off being potentially likable, but then keeps making terrible decision after terrible decision until we no longer root for him. This is a tricky balance, and I actually need to make a video talking about how to adapt Gawyn, because again, he's salvageable as a character, but there's a lot to talk about in how to make him work. I would start by playing up Gawyn's humor and self-deprecation from the beginning. That's in the books, but it's not enough to really make him likable enough to carry through, so they should play that up more. Have Egwene notice him right away rather than Galad. Just cut right to the chase, and I think it will help with their dynamic. Gawyn is always feeling overshadowed by Galad, and if they play that up a little bit more and do it in the right way, it's a relatable thing that could again make Gawyn more likable. And if Egwene is noticing him when everyone else can't get past Galad to even see him, it could help their dynamic. Next, when Gawyn participates in the Tower coup, but then has enough conscience to set Swan and Lyanna free, he should carry that through and leave with them. It never really made sense that he stayed with Elaida, and this would bring him to Saladar so that he and Egwene would have an opportunity to fall in love more at leisure. I think there would still be that essential conflict where he's not able to stand back and be the support person to Egwene. So it would still lead to tragic decisions and his death. But in the meantime, we would like him better in the first place. We could believe more in his love with Egwene. And when it all falls apart, we could actually care, and not just because Egwene is also dead. So it's changing a lot of things, but I think it could be worth it. My last pairing in this group might surprise you because they're not really a couple in the main narrative as they are in New Spring. That is Moiraine and Swan. This would be an easy one to cut, but here's why I think that they should instead expand it. First, I should say that as written, they're not really lovers. They're what Robert Jordan called pillow friends. That is, they have a sexual relationship, but it's generally expected that they would leave that behind them when they become Aes Sedai. And so when they go their separate ways, there's not really a big fuss made about it, and they talk casually about the possibility of being with men. And yet they clearly care for each other. The setup between them and the shared history in New Spring is actually really potent. They have a world-shattering secret, and they can only trust the other with it until Lan comes in the picture. They clearly admire and respect and challenge each other. They're the most important person in the world to each other. And yet, their shared mission draws them in separate directions, and secrets crop up between them, and so their trust is not as complete as it once was, and they don't necessarily agree on how to handle the biggest threat facing the world. That is a huge amount of potential that should not go to waste between these two really important characters. So what would I change? Mainly just that they should not be pillow friends. They should be lovers, and this should be addressed in one of two ways. Either they explicitly break up when they have to separate, and that would give us a more powerful parting scene, or they don't, and they go on loving each other from afar, and whenever they can be together, they try to recapture what they had. In practice, these changes aren't difficult to do because the material is there, but it does mean weaving in a lot of that history and their dynamic into the main narrative that was not originally there. A lot of this could be accomplished through flashbacks, and we have good reason to think they might be doing this based on the casting of Kira Chansa as young Swan. And there might need to be some additional scenes in the main narrative whenever possible as well. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise that in my Balefire category, I have both Moiraine and Tom and Swan and Gareth. Now, to be fair, it's actually possible to do both the changes I suggested for Moiraine and Swan and to include both of these relationships if they were to have Moiraine and Swan break up. And I'm not even against that necessarily if changes were made to these subsequent relationships. But if I'm reading the tea leaves right, it doesn't look like they're going in that direction. I've talked in previous videos about how it looks very much like Tom and Moiraine are not going to interact at all in season 1. And if they were to bother to include that pairing, the only way they should is if they actually expand their interactions and make clearer their feelings. If they're not going in that direction, then they should just balefire it and maybe give Tom a different romance. I mean, they cast Alex Willam and gave him a guitar, so someone's going to fall in love, right? As for Swan and Gareth, if either of those two relationships were to be kept, this one seems more likely. And to be fair, it has the time allotted to it to potentially make it work. But there are a lot of elements about it that really make me uncomfortable and that I think are likely to be problematic for a modern audience. In brief, I dislike that they are falling in love while she is acting like a servant to him and that he presses that power he has over her. I especially dislike that he seems to think her broken promise to him is more important than the work she's doing, which affects no less than the fate of the world. And of course, they also have the problem of domestic violence when Swan throws boots at Gareth and he spanks her. Ugh. Swan is a fascinating character, and I really love that when she loses almost all of her power, she keeps fighting for her mission, even in her changed circumstances. So she deserves better. And if they do decide to include this relationship, I hope they take a hard look at that power dynamic and make some major changes. Lastly, I would balefire Morghese and Talonvor for somewhat similar reasons to Swan and Gareth in that certain aspects of this relationship make me uncomfortable. And it doesn't really seem worth the effort to try and fix it. It's the fact that Morghese had suffered so much abuse and trauma, and yet she had people around her putting all this pressure on her to be with Talonvor, even though she said she didn't want to be with him. It doesn't matter that he was a good guy and would treat her right, or even that maybe deep down she actually did want to be with him. I still don't want to see people putting pressure on her when she is reluctant. maybe Morghez's role in the show will end up being reduced, and this will end up being a moot point. But if it's not, I'm not opposed to her having a different romance. I always wanted Tam and Morghez to have this connection because they have this headcanon where they actually met when they were younger and Tam was in the Illianer army, and that is how Morghez had come to hear Two Rivers' speech in her youth. And I think that Tam is someone that Morghez could feel safe with. Let's finally just touch on a few smaller romances. And what I want to say about these is that any of them could be kept because they either work well enough or really well as they are. But it's also just as likely that any or all of them could be cut, simply because the characters in question either might have a much smaller role in the show or because it wouldn't significantly affect the narrative to cut it. And these three are Galad and Berelain, Pavara and Andral, and Baeldomen and Aegyanan. Now, I especially like Pavara and Andral, but if Logain ends up being a major character throughout the series, he might end up having the most significant role in the Black Tower plot in place of Andral, and Andral could end up cut or significantly reduced. In this scenario, I think it's possible that Logain might get a romance instead. I could see a couple of possibilities here. One is that Logain is given a romance with an Aes Sedai in a similar fashion to Pavara and Andral, or they could instead focus on a romance between two Ashaman, of which Logain could be one of them. So please let me know in the comments all of your thoughts on these suggested changes to romances in the Wheel of Time. If you enjoyed the video, please smash that like button, share the video, of course, subscribe. And until next time, gird your loins, my friends.